So in today's web dev tip, we're just going to add a bit of a convenience route into our app so that when someone accesses a short URL and then / a particular identifier, such as info or data, we can actually redirect them to the stats page, to the stats app that we've got set up. So we're basically going to be creating a redirect route in Express. But over in the routing file for our redirect URLs at the moment, you can see we've got two endpoints set up. The first is just to handle the actual redirect itself. So anyone accessing the API URL or that short domain that we set up a few lessons ago will be redirected as per the information in the database. But the other thing is we've got the stats endpoint as well. And all that does really is return the entry in the database so that we can generate the stats information on the page. So we could use that stats identifier and hijack that route to actually say this is the route that's going to do the redirect, but we'll create a new one for our purposes so that we can keep that intact and we don't have to make any other changes in the rest of the apps. So we're just going to set up a new get endpoint and it's / ID. So we're going to pass in the ID in the path parameters, and we could put something like view stats, for example, or as mentioned, it could be like info or data. So it's up to you what you actually put in here. And then we're just going to actually open up the function with the express request and response objects, and we'll keep it async as well. Just in case we want to use the database functions, which is an interesting point because what we could do at this point is we can get the ID from the path parameters as we have done previously in other routes as well. So we'll just copy that and put that there. So at this point, do we actually blindly redirect the user to the stats application with the ID and say just load up the stats for this particular ID, or do we do a database check first to see if this ID actually exists? So if you do the latter and actually look the item up in the database, we need to then be in a position where we need to send a response to the user. We don't really know where they're coming from, so we could send them to a kind of 404 page or something in the stats application, but we don't actually have anything like that. So I think in this example it's probably better to just redirect the user to the stats application, which will then actually do a get request for the stats information. And as you can see from the information here, from the error messages here, that if we can't find an item in the database, we'll return a message. So we'll let that function be called and let it do the check for the item in the database, and then it will handle the non-existence of items automatically for us. So once we've got the ID of the short URL from the path, all we really need to do is say return res.redirect. So where are we going to redirect the user to? Well, we want to redirect it to the stats application, and I don't think we've got that set up in our environment variables at the moment. We've got a reference to the API itself, but not the actual application. So we'll say stats app URL. We'll add this in here. So for our development machine, it's going to be on localhost, and then it's port 4400 is where the app is running, but also in production it's slightly different because we've mounted it into a different folder. So it'll be not localhost, it will be https, and then it's rickandroll.me / stats. So that's the endpoint in production. So let's go back to our route here. So what we can do when we're actually doing our redirect, we'll say environment stats app URL, and then / and then we want to use the ID that we've just extracted from the path parameter. So what will happen when someone accesses this route now is we'll get the ID and then we'll redirect the user to the stats app with the ID appended as the last part of the path. So we should be able to just test that out quickly now. So if we just go to the stats app locally, for example, actually we need to go to the stats application itself. So let's just put in a random ID and then pass in the view stats path, which is the route that we've just created. So you can see we've been redirected to the app running on 4400, which is indeed the stats app, and you can see we're getting this message saying that no short URL with that ID exists. But if we try that again, let's just grab a proper ID that we've created in the database. So let's go over here again, and from the API we'll say / that ID and then view stats. And that seems to be not found as well. It's because the stats app, I think, needs to have the / stats on there. which will obviously show us the data. So that's a mistake in the environment variable there. Let's go back and fix that. So for localhost, we want /stats on there as well. So just to test that out one last time, this should do it this time for the redirect. So / the ID and then view stats. And you can see we're being redirected to the stats app now based off of that endpoint in the API. So what's the point of that? Well, the point is that when we generate a short URL like this in the production app, the user can take that and then they can just append view stats onto the end of that short URL, and then they'll be redirected into the stats application to view the stats of anyone who's accessed it. There you go, there's just a quick way to set up a redirect in an Express app. In the next tutorial, we're going to work on another part of the stats application, which is the home page, because you may have seen in your application that if we just go to /stats, we don't actually see anything, it's just a blank holding page. So we're going to put some content in there so the user can actually use that home page to access other stats, other short URL ID stats if they need to. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.